The wind was cold that night in King's Landing. It carried the smell of the sea and the smoke of 1,000 fires. Inside the Red Keep, the halls were quiet, but in the Hand's chambers, Eddard Stark stood near the window, staring into the dark city. He had been thinking about the past all evening. The rebellion, the war, the lies. For years he had buried those memories deep inside his heart. But coming to King's Landing had opened old wounds again. Every stone of the Red Keep reminded him of the day the war ended, and the things that followed. A knock came at the door. Before Ned could answer, the door opened loudly, and Robert Baratheon walked in, holding a wine cup in one hand. "Gods, Ned!" Robert laughed loudly. "You always hide in this gloomy room like an old maester." Robert dropped heavily into a chair and poured more wine. Ned turned slowly from the window. Robert looked older than the man Ned remembered from the war. His belly was large now, his beard messy, and his eyes tired. But the loud voice and careless smile was still the same. "You should drink with me," Robert said. "The wine here is better than that northern swill you drink in Winterfell." Ned didn't smile. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Robert rolled his eyes. "That sounds serious already." Ned stepped closer. The torchlight flickered across his serious face. "It's about the past." Robert froze for a moment, then took another long drink. "The past," Robert said. "Seven hells, Ned. Why would we talk about that? We won. The war is dumb." "That's exactly why," Ned replied. The room became silent. Outside, the wind howled against the castle walls. Robert leaned back in his chair. "Fine," he said. "Say what you want to say." Ned's voice became colder. "Lyanna." The name hit the room like a blade. Robert's smile disappeared immediately. For years, Robert had spoken of Lyanna Stark as the love of his life, the woman stolen by Rhaegar Targaryen, the woman Robert believed he had died for, the woman whose death started the rebellion. Robert gripped his cup tighter. "What about her?" he asked quietly. Ned looked straight into Robert's eyes. "You think you know what happened to her?" Robert slammed the cup on the table. "I know exactly what happened," he shouted. "That dragon prince kidnapped her. I killed his family for it, and I would do it again." Ned did not move. "You never asked me what I saw," Ned said. Robert frowned. "What do you mean?" Ned's voice was calm, but there was pain inside it. "When I found her, in the Tower of Joy." Robert stared at him. He'd heard this story many times before, but Ned had never told him everything. "What about it?" Robert said. Ned hesitated for a moment. Memories filled his mind again. The tower in the desert, the dead Kingsguard, the smell of blood, Lyanna lying in a bed, weak and pale, her whisper, a final request. "Promise me, Ned." Ned clenched his hands slowly. "There are things you never asked," Ned continued, "and things I never told." Robert's voice grew harder. "Are you saying the stories are lies?" Ned looked away for a moment. "Some of them are." Robert stood up slowly now. The drunken laziness was gone from his face. "What lies?" he asked. Ned turned back to him. "Rhaegar." Robert's eyes filled with anger. "That bastard deserved worse than death." "Maybe," Ned said quietly. "But he did not kidnap Lyanna." The room went silent again. For a moment, Robert looked like he had not heard the words correctly. Then his face turned red with rage. "What did you say?" Ned did not step back. "Lyanna was not kidnapped." Robert grabbed the table and pushed it aside violently. "That's madness," he roared. "Everyone knows he stole her." Ned shook his head slowly. "No, that is the story people believed." Robert stepped closer now, towering over Ned. "Then tell me the truth," Robert demanded. Ned's voice was heavy. "The truth is, she went with him." The words felt like thunder in the room. Robert's face turned pale. For years, his entire life had been built on revenge and grief. And now Ned Stark, the one man he trusted most, was tearing that belief apart. Robert whispered slowly, "You're lying." Ned did not answer immediately. Instead, he said something that made Robert's heart pound. And there is something else you never knew. Robert stared at him. What? Ned took a slow breath. The child. Robert frowned. What child? Ned looked directly into the king's eyes. The child Lyanna died protecting. Robert's heart began to beat faster. What child, Ned? Ned's voice dropped almost to a whisper. Her son. Robert's eyes widened in shock. For the first time in years, the king of the Seven Kingdoms looked afraid, and the truth Ned Stark had hidden for nearly 2 decades was about to break the world apart. The room felt smaller after Ned spoke those words. For a few seconds, Robert Baratheon did not move at all. His large hands were still resting on the table he had pushed aside. His breathing became slow and heavy. Her son, Robert finally said. Across from him, Eddard Stark stood silent. The weight of the secret he had carried for almost 17 years sat heavily on his shoulders. Robert suddenly laughed, but it was not a happy laugh. It was bitter. That's a poor joke, Ned, Robert said. You always were terrible at humor. Ned did not smile. I am not joking. Robert's laughter slowly died. The king's face became serious again. Lyanna died, Robert said slowly. You told me yourself. You said she died in a bed of blood. She did, Ned replied quietly. Then what son are you talking about? Ned's mind drifted back to that terrible day, the hot desert wind, the White Tower, the 3 Kingsguards standing outside like silent statues. Sir Arthur Dayne had drawn his sword without fear. We swore a vow, he had said. Many good men had died that day, but the memory that haunted Ned the most was not the battle. It was what he found inside the tower. Lyanna, weak and pale, lying in a bed soaked with blood. Her voice barely stronger than a whisper. Promise me, Ned. Robert's angry voice pulled Ned back to the present. You're hiding something, Robert said. I can see it on your face. Ned took a slow breath. Yes. Robert's eyes narrowed. Then say it. Ned looked directly at him. That child was born in the Tower of Joy. Robert frowned. That doesn't make sense, he said. Why would Lyanna have a child there? Ned did not answer immediately, because he knew the next words would change everything. Robert stepped closer, his boots hitting the stone floor heavily. Who was the father? The question hung in the air like a blade. Ned felt his chest tighten. For years, he protected this secret. Not even his own wife knew the truth. But now the king himself was asking. And Robert Baratheon hated only one family more than anyone in the world. The Targaryens. Ned spoke slowly. You already know the father. Robert stared at him. No, he said. Yes. The king's voice became harder. Say his name. Ned closed his eyes for a brief moment. Then he said it. Rhaegar Targaryen. Robert's reaction was instant. The king roared with rage and grabbed Ned by the collar. You dare speak that dragon's name to me? Robert shouted. His face was red with fury. That monster kidnapped her. He raped her. He destroyed everything. Ned did not fight back. No, he said firmly. He did not. Robert froze. What? They loved each other, Ned said. The silence in the room became heavy. Robert slowly released Ned's collar. That's impossible. It is the truth. Robert shook his head again and again. No, Lyanna loved me. She was promised to me. Ned's voice was gentle but honest. You loved the idea of her. Robert's fists tightened. She never wanted the life you dreamed of giving her. Robert stared at him like a wounded animal. You're lying. Ned shook his head. When I found her, she wasn't angry at Rhaegar. Robert whispered almost to himself. No. She begged me to protect her son. Robert's breathing grew faster. And you did? He asked slowly. Ned nodded once. Yes. Robert suddenly understood what Ned was saying. A terrible realization appeared on his face. Where is the child? Robert demanded. Ned hesitated. Robert stepped closer again, his voice rising. Where is he, Ned? Ned knew there was no turning back now. The truth had already begun to break free. He spoke quietly. He is alive. Robert's eyes widened. Alive? Robert's eyes widened. Alive? Yes. Where? Ned's voice was almost a whisper now. He grew up in the north. Robert's mind raced. A boy in the north, a secret child. Suddenly one face appeared in his thoughts. Dark hair, quiet nature. The boy Ned claimed was his own bastard. Robert's voice came out slowly. No. Ned said nothing. Robert's eyes filled with disbelief. You mean you could barely say the name? Jon Snow? Ned finally nodded. The truth was now fully spoken. For a moment, Robert looked like the ground had disappeared under his feet. The boy he had laughed with, the boy he had called Ned Shame, the boy living peacefully in Winterfell was the son of the man Robert hated most in the world, and the last blood of the Targaryens. Robert's voice became cold and dangerous. You hid a dragon in your own home. Ned stood firm. I protected my sister's last wish. Robert's face twisted with anger. That boy has Targaryen blood, yes. Robert whispered something dark. All Targaryens must die. Ned's eyes hardened. Not this one. The two old friends now stood facing each other like enemies, and the secret that had slept for 17 years had finally awakened. The storm between them had only just begun. The silence between Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon felt heavier than armor. Robert walked away slowly and grabbed another wine jug from the table. His hands were shaking, though he tried to hide it. He filled his cup, but did not drink immediately. A Targaryen, Robert muttered. All these years, a Targaryen under your roof. Ned watched him carefully. Not just a Targaryen, Ned said quietly. Lyanna's son. Robert finally drank the wine in one long gulp. That changes nothing, he said harshly. Dragon blood is dragon blood. Ned's voice became firmer. He is also Stark blood. Robert slammed the cup down again. Do not twist this. Robert shouted. His father was Rhaegar Targaryen, the same man who started the war that killed thousands. Ned shook his head slowly. The war started because of lies. Robert laughed bitterly. Lies. My betrothed disappeared with a prince. That is not a lie. Ned stepped closer. She went willingly. Robert looked like he wanted to punch the wall. I will never believe that. Ned sighed. You don't want to believe it. Robert's eyes burned with anger. But beneath that anger there was something else. Pain. For years he had told himself a story, that Lyanna loved him, that she was stolen, that the war was a righteous revenge. But Ned's words were tearing that story apart, piece by piece. Robert suddenly asked quietly, Did she ever say my name? The question surprised Ned. For the first time that night, Robert did not sound like a king. He sounded like a broken man. Ned answered honestly, No. Robert looked away. The torchlight flickered on the walls as the wind outside grew louder. After a long silence, Robert spoke again. So the boy lives in Winterfell. Yes. And everyone believes he is your bastard. Yes. And everyone believes he is your bastard. Yes. Robert stared at Ned again. You lied to the entire kingdom. I protected a child. You protected the last Targaryen. Robert roared. Ned's eyes hardened. I protected my sister. Robert paced across the room like a caged lion. You should have told me, he said. Ned shook his head. No. Robert stopped walking. Why? Ned answered immediately. Because you would have killed him. Robert did not deny it. Instead, he said something cold. I still might. The words hung in the air like a threat. Ned's hand slowly moved to the table beside him, gripping the wood tightly. You will not. Robert laughed angrily. You think you can stop me? I know I must. Robert stepped closer again. That boy has a claim to the throne. Ned shook his head. He does not want it. That does not matter, Robert snapped. Rebellions start with smaller things than that. Ned's voice grew sharper. He is a boy of honor. He would never fight for the throne. Robert pointed a finger at him. You said the same about his father. Ned went silent. Robert's face became darker. I crushed the Targaryens once, he said. I will not allow their blood to rise again. Ned looked directly at the king. "Then you will have to kill me first." The words shocked even Robert. "You would stand against your king?" Robert asked. "I would stand for my family." The two old friends stared at each other again. The same men who once fought side by side during Robert's rebellion were now on opposite sides of a different war. Robert's voice lowered. "You always were too honorable, Ned, and you were always too quick to hate." Robert clenched his fists. "That hatred built this kingdom." Ned answered quietly, "No, it only buried the truth." Robert turned away again. For several moments neither man spoke. Then Robert asked something unexpected. "Does the boy know?" Ned immediately shook his head. "No." "Why?" "Why? Because his life depends on it." Robert rubbed his face with both hands. "A dragon raised as a wolf," he muttered. Ned said nothing. Robert suddenly looked up again. "Does anyone else know?" "No." "Not even Captain Stark?" "No." Robert stared at him in disbelief. "You carried this secret alone for 17 years. Ned nodded slowly. "Yes." Ned nodded slowly. "Yes." Robert sat down heavily in his chair again. For the first time since entering the room, he looked tired instead of angry. "You fool," Robert muttered. "Perhaps." Another long silence filled the chamber. Then Robert spoke again, his voice quieter but dangerous. "If anyone else learns this truth, the realm will bleed again." Ned knew he was right, because the moment people heard the name Targaryen, many lords would rise again. Robert looked directly at Ned. "The boy must never come south." "He won't. And he must never learn who he really is." Ned hesitated. Robert noticed immediately. "What?" the king asked. Ned answered slowly. "One day, he deserves the truth." Robert's face hardened again. That day must never come. But neither man noticed something important. Outside the chamber door, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, someone had been listening the entire time. A thin smile slowly appeared on the face of Petyr Baelish. And in King's Landing, secrets were more valuable than gold. Outside the chamber door, the hallway of the Red Keep was quiet and dark. Torches flickered on the stone walls, and most of the castle had already gone to sleep. But one man stood silently in the shadows, listening to every word. Petyr Baelish had not meant to hear such a dangerous secret. He had only come to speak with Eddard Stark about small matters of coin and politics. But when he heard raised voices inside the chamber, he paused. And then he heard a name that made his curiosity grow. Targaryen. Petyr's sharp eyes gleamed slightly in the torchlight. Inside the room, the conversation between Ned and Robert Baratheon had grown quieter, but Littlefinger had already heard enough. A hidden prince, the son of Rhaegar Targaryen, living quietly in Winterfell. Petyr Baelish slowly smiled. "Chaos," he whispered softly to himself, "is a ladder." He stepped away from the door silently and walked down the hallway like nothing had happened. Inside the chamber, Robert poured more wine. The king had drunk too much already, but tonight he needed it. His mind felt like a storm. 17 years, Robert muttered. Ned remained standing near the table. "Yes." Robert shook his head slowly. "You lied to me for 17 years. I protected my sister's son." Robert looked up at him sharply. "You protected the son of my enemy." Ned answered firmly. "He is not your enemy." Robert slammed his fist on the table. "All Targaryens are my enemies." The words echoed in the chamber, but after saying them, Robert suddenly looked tired again. He leaned back in his chair. "I killed his father with my own hammer," Robert said quietly. Ned remembered that day well. The battle at the river during Battle of the Trident had decided the war. Robert and Rhaegar had met in the middle of the river like two giants of legend, and Robert's warhammer had crushed the Dragon Prince's chest. "The boy is not his father," Ned said. Robert sighed heavily. "That is what people always say." Ned stepped closer. "Jon is an honorable boy." Robert looked up suddenly. "You just said his name." Ned realized it too late. For a moment, Robert stared at him. "Jon?" the king repeated slowly. "Yes." Robert leaned forward. "That boy I met at Winterfell. Quiet, dark-haired, always watching everything. Ned said nothing. Robert rubbed his beard. I remember thinking you looked more like a Stark than a bastard. Ned allowed himself a small smile. He was raised as one. Robert sighed again. You should have told me the truth. And risk his life? Robert did not answer. The king's eyes moved to the window, staring into the dark night outside. If the realm discovers this secret, Robert said, half the lords will rise in rebellion. Ned nodded slowly. I know. Targaryen loyalists still exist. Yes, and if they find the boy. Robert did not finish the sentence. But Ned understood. They would crown him. Robert stood up again. I cannot allow that. Ned's voice became colder. You cannot kill a child for a war that ended years ago. Robert looked directly at him. He is not a child anymore. Ned knew that was true. Jon Snow was nearly a man now. He has no desire for crowns, Ned said. Robert laughed bitterly. Crowns have a strange way of finding people. For a moment, neither man spoke. Finally, Robert walked toward the door. I need air, he muttered. He opened the chamber door and stepped into the hallway. But the hallway was empty. Littlefinger was long gone. Robert leaned against the cold stone wall. Ned, he said quietly. Ned stepped out beside him. Robert stared down the long corridor. If anyone ever learns this truth, the realm will burn, Ned finished. Robert nodded. Then he said something surprising. I will not send assassins. Ned looked at him carefully. Robert sighed. Not because I trust the boy. Then why? Ned asked. Robert's voice was softer now. Because Lyanna was your sister. Ned felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Robert looked up again. But if that boy ever raises a banner against me, Ned answered before Robert could finish. He won't. Robert stared at him for a long moment. You always believed in people too much, and you believed in them too little. Robert almost smiled at that. But far away in another part of the Red Keep, Petyr Baelish was already planning. Secrets like this could destroy kingdoms or create new kings. And somewhere in the cold north, far away from the games of the south, Jon Snow had no idea that his life and the fate of the Seven Kingdoms had just changed forever. The storm was coming, and this time it would not begin with war. It would begin with whispers. The next morning in the Red Keep felt strangely calm. The sun rose over King's Landing, lighting the towers and walls with warm gold. But beneath that peaceful morning, secrets were already moving through the castle like quiet snakes. In a quiet garden courtyard, Petyr Baelish walked slowly along the stone path, thinking carefully. He had slept very little. The secret he heard the night before kept returning to his mind. A hidden Targaryen, the son of Rhaegar Targaryen, raised in the north by Eddard Stark. Petyr smiled slightly. A bastard wolf hiding a dragon, he murmured. Footsteps approached from behind him. Petyr did not even turn around. I wondered how long it would take you to appear, he said calmly. A soft voice answered from the shadows. You always expect me, Lord Baelish. Petyr turned slowly. Standing near the stone archway was Varys, the master of whisperers. His round face wore its usual polite smile. I hear many interesting things in this castle, Varys said gently. Petyr chuckled. As do I. The two men began walking together through the garden. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Petyr said casually, Tell me, Lord Varys, do you enjoy secrets? Varys folded his hands calmly. Secrets are the currency of the realm. Petyr nodded. Then I may have discovered a very expensive one. Varys glanced at him with mild curiosity. Oh? Petyr leaned closer and lowered his voice. What would you say if I told you that a dragon still lives? Varys stopped walking. For the first time, the calm spider looked truly interested. A bold statement, Varys said softly. Petyr's smile widened. Not just any dragon. He spoke the next words slowly. The son of Rhaegar. Varys's eyes narrowed slightly. That is impossible. That is exactly what I thought, Petyr replied. Until I heard it with my own ears. Varys studied him carefully. From whom? Petyr shrugged lightly. Let us say, from a very honorable man who trusts the wrong walls. Varys understood immediately. Lord Stark. Petyr did not confirm it, but his smile said enough. Varys became silent. The information was dangerous. If true, it could change everything in the Seven Kingdoms. And where is this supposed dragon? Varys asked. Petyr answered easily. In the north. Varys already suspected the next part, with Stark. Petyr nodded. He has been there all along. Varys thought carefully. There are no young Targaryens in Winterfell. Petyr raised one finger, officially. Varys looked at him sharply. Who? Petyr spoke the name quietly. Jon Snow. The garden became silent. Even the birds seemed quiet. Varys slowly breathed in. Stark's bastard. So the world believes. Varys began walking again slowly. If this is true, it explains much. Petyr tilted his head. Oh? Lord Stark's unusual protection of the boy, Varys said, and his refusal to speak of the boy's mother. Petyr laughed softly. Even the most honorable man can tell a very large lie. Varys stopped again. Does the king know? Petyr nodded. Oh yes. Varys looked surprised. And he allows the boy to live, for now. Varys understood the meaning behind those words. Robert Baratheon hated Targaryens more than anything. If his anger returned, the boy would be in grave danger. Petyr spoke again. Imagine it, Lord Varys, the last dragon raised among wolves. Varys folded his hands again. Such knowledge must be handled carefully. Petyr smirked. Of course. But knowledge like this can move armies. Varys looked at him calmly. And what do you plan to do with it? Petyr's eyes gleamed. Nothing. Varys did not believe that for a second. Petyr continued, for now. Far away in the cold north, snow was falling outside the ancient walls of Winterfell. In the training yard, Jon Snow practiced with a sword. Steel clashed against steel as he sparred with another young fighter. Jon moved quickly and skillfully. The Stark training had made him strong, but he had no idea that far to the south, powerful men were speaking his name in quiet gardens. No idea that his true blood had been discovered, and no idea that the Game of Thrones was slowly reaching toward him. Back in King's Landing, Varys spoke again. If this truth spreads, the realm will drown in blood. Petyr smiled calmly. Then perhaps we should decide who hears it first. Varys looked at him carefully. You are playing a dangerous game. Petyr answered simply, the only game that matters. And somewhere far away, the last hidden dragon continued training with a sword, completely unaware that his destiny was beginning to awaken. The pieces on the board were moving. And soon, Jon Snow would no longer be just a bastard of Winterfell. Far in the north, snow covered the ancient towers of Winterfell. The cold wind blew across the castle walls, carrying the smell of pine trees and ice. Life in Winterfell was quiet, simple, and far away from the dangerous politics of the south. In the training yard, swords clashed loudly. Jon Snow stepped back quickly, blocking another strike. His opponent swung again, but Jon turned his blade and pushed him off balance. The other boy stumbled into the snow. A few guards nearby laughed. Good move, Snow, one of them said. Jon lowered his sword and helped the boy stand up. You're getting faster, the boy said, brushing snow from his coat. Jon smiled slightly. I've had good teachers. He looked toward the castle walls where Robb Stark stood watching. Robb raised a hand and shouted, You fight like a northern wolf now! Jon laughed. But even while laughing, something inside him felt strange. For the past few days, Jon had been feeling restless, a strange feeling he could not explain, almost like something important was changing somewhere far away. He shook the thought away. It was probably nothing. Meanwhile, thousands of miles to the south, the game of secrets was becoming more dangerous. Inside a quiet chamber in the Red Keep, Varys sat across from Petyr Baelish. Between them sat a sealed letter. Petyr tapped the table with one finger. A single letter could change the world, he said calmly. Varys looked at the letter, but did not touch it. And who would receive such a letter? Petyr smiled. Someone curious enough to ask questions. Dangerous questions, Varys replied. Petyr leaned back in his chair. Imagine if the right person in Winterfell started wondering about Jon Snow's true parents. Varys's voice remained calm. Lord Stark would never allow that. Petyr shrugged. Even the most honorable men cannot control every whisper. Varys studied him carefully. You plan to create chaos. Petyr smiled wider. I prefer to call it opportunity. Varys sighed quietly. The realm has barely recovered from Robert's rebellion. Petyr answered simply, then perhaps it is ready for something new. Back in Winterfell, evening had arrived. The great hall was warm with firelight. Servants moved between tables carrying food, while guards and soldiers talked loudly. Jon sat at a table with Robb. You fought well today, Robb said, tearing a piece of bread. Jon shrugged. You were the better fighter. Robb laughed. Only because I had to beat you before you grew stronger. Jon smiled. The two had grown up like brothers, but suddenly a servant entered the hall carrying a small parchment. Message from the south, the servant said. The parchment was handed to the Maester of Winterfell, who began reading it near the fire. Jon didn't think much about it. Messages from the south came often. But after a moment, the Maester frowned slightly. Robb noticed. What is it? Robb asked. The Maester shook his head slowly. It is strange. Strange how? Robb asked. The Maester looked at the parchment again. It asks a very unusual question. Jon looked up now, curious. What question? The Maester hesitated before answering. It asks if Lord Stark ever spoke about the mother of Jon Snow. Jon froze. The hall suddenly felt quieter. Robb looked confused. Why would anyone ask that? The Maester shook his head again. There is no name on the letter. Jon felt a strange chill run down his spine. For years he had wondered about his mother, but his father, Eddard Stark, had always refused to speak about her. Robb noticed Jon's silence. It's probably some drunk lord from the south, Robb said. Ignore it. Jon nodded slowly, but deep inside, the question had already planted a seed in his mind. Who was his mother? And why would someone in the south suddenly ask about it? Far away in King's Landing, Petyr Baelish stood by a window looking toward the dark sea. Behind him, Varys spoke quietly. You have started something dangerous. Petyr smiled without turning around. The most interesting things always are. Varys asked one final question. And if the boy learns the truth? Petyr's smile grew slightly darker. Then the game truly begins. Because if Jon Snow ever discovered who he truly was, he would not only be a bastard of Winterfell, he would be the last living heir of House Targaryen. And that truth could tear the Seven Kingdoms apart. The winds of the north were rising, and soon even Jon Snow would begin to wonder who he really was. Snow fell heavily over Winterfell that night. The wind howled across the towers and most of the castle had gone quiet. Fires burned low in the halls as guards walked slowly along the walls. But sleep would not come to Jon Snow. He sat alone in his small chamber, staring at the flame of a candle. The strange letter from the south kept returning to his mind again and again. Who was asking about his mother, and why now? For years, Jon had tried not to think about it. Every time he asked his father, Eddard Stark would simply grow quiet and change the subject. Jon whispered softly to himself, "Why does no one speak of her?" The candle flickered as the cold wind touched the window. Finally, Jon stood up. If answers existed in Winterfell, there was one place that might hold them. The old crypts. The crypts of Winterfell were ancient. Dark stone stairs led deep beneath the castle where the statues of old Stark kings rested beside their tombs. Jon carried a torch as he walked down the narrow steps. The deeper he went, the colder the air became. Statues lined both sides of the stone hall. Each statue held a stone sword across its lap. Jon walked slowly between them. He had come here many times as a child, But tonight, it felt different. Tonight he was searching for something. Finally, he stopped in front of one statue, the statue of Lyanna Stark. Jon looked up at the stone face. He had always been told she was his father's sister, a wild and brave woman who died during the war many years ago. But now something about her story felt strange. Jon studied the statue carefully. "Who were you?" he whispered. The torchlight danced across the stone. Something about the statue bothered him. The face, the shape of the eyes. Jon suddenly felt a strange feeling in his chest. The face looked familiar, very familiar, almost like footsteps echoed behind him. Jon turned quickly. An old voice spoke from the darkness. "You should not wander the crypts alone at night." The voice belonged to Maester Luwin. The old maester stepped closer, holding his own lantern. Jon relaxed slightly. "I couldn't sleep," Jon said. Luwin looked at him kindly. "Thinking about the letter?" Jon nodded. "Yes." The maester sighed softly. "Curiosity can be a heavy burden." Jon looked back at Lyanna's statue. "Did you know her?" Luwin followed Jon's gaze. "Yes, I did." Jon hesitated before asking the next question. "What was she like?" The maester smiled slightly. "Wild, brave, stubborn." Jon frowned. "Like my father?" Luwin chuckled. "No, more like you." Jon looked surprised. "Me?" "Yes." The old maester studied Jon carefully. "You remind me of her in many ways." Jon looked back at the statue again. Ty returned. "Maester, did she ever come back to Winterfell during the war?" Luwin's smile faded slightly. "No." "Why not?" The maester hesitated. "Because she died far from here." Jon looked at him carefully. "Where?" Luwin answered quietly. "In the south." Jon's mind raced. In the south. The letter came from the south. The war happened in the south, and his father had returned from the south with a newborn child. Jon suddenly asked another question. "Maester, when my father returned after the war, Luwin already knew what Jon was thinking, but the old maester chose his words carefully." "Yes?" Jon swallowed. "Did he bring me with him?" Luwin did not answer immediately. The silence felt heavy. Finally, the maester said, "Yes." Jon's heart beat faster. "From where?" Luwin hesitated again. "That I do not know." But the look in the old maester's eyes suggested he knew more than he was saying. Jon looked back at Lyanna's statue. The resemblance between the statue and his own face now seemed impossible to ignore. A terrible thought slowly formed in his mind. But before he could speak it, a loud horn suddenly echoed across Winterfell's walls. Both men looked up. Another horn followed. Then another. Jon turned toward the stairs. "That's the gate," he said. They quickly climbed the steps back to the surface. When Jon reached the courtyard, soldiers were already gathering near the main gate. Robb stood among them. "What's happening?" Jon asked. Robb pointed toward the entrance. "Riders from the south." The heavy gates of Winterfell slowly opened. A group of armored riders entered the castle. At their head was a royal banner, the golden stag of Robert Baratheon. Jon frowned in confusion. "The king?" Robb looked just as surprised. He wasn't expected. But far away in King's Landing, Robert had made a sudden decision. He needed to see the boy with his own eyes, because somewhere deep inside his heart, Robert Baratheon feared that Ned Stark had told the truth. And if that boy truly carried the blood of House Targaryen, then the fate of the Seven Kingdoms might soon change forever. The king had come north, and the truth was getting closer to Jon Snow than ever before. Morning came slowly over Winterfell. The sky was grey, and snow still covered the ground like a white blanket. The castle courtyard was busy earlier than usual. Soldiers moved around quickly, preparing for the arrival of a royal guest. Word had already spread through the castle. Robert Baratheon, the king of the Seven Kingdoms, had arrived in the north. In the great hall, servants rushed to prepare a large meal. Robb Stark stood near the doors, watching the courtyard outside. Beside him stood Jon Snow, still confused about the sudden arrival. "This makes no sense," Robb said quietly. "Kings don't ride north without reason." Jon nodded. "Maybe something happened in the south." Robb shrugged. "Maybe, but both young men knew something felt strange." Meanwhile, in the courtyard, the royal horses stopped near the castle steps. The soldiers of Winterfell stood in lines as the king climbed down from his horse. Robert looked older than the stories Jon had heard. His armor stretched tightly over his large belly, and his beard was thicker than before, but his presence was still powerful. Behind him stood several guards and knights. One of them carried the royal banner with a golden stag. Robert looked up at the tall towers of Winterfell and smiled slightly. "So this is the north again," he muttered. The heavy doors of the great hall opened. Robb walked forward first and bowed respectfully. "Your Grace, welcome to Winterfell." Robert laughed loudly. "No need for all that formality, boy." Then his eyes moved behind Robb, and he saw Jon. For a brief moment, the king froze. The boy standing there had dark hair like a Stark. But something about his face, something about his eyes, Robert suddenly felt his chest tighten. The face looked familiar, very familiar. He slowly walked closer. Jon bowed politely. "Your Grace." Robert stared at him carefully. "So you're the famous Jon Snow," the king said. Jon looked slightly surprised. "You know my name?" Robert gave a small smile. "I visited Winterfell once before, years ago. You were just a child then." Jon nodded quietly. "I remember." Robert studied him even more closely now. The boy stood tall, strong, and calm. Too calm. Robert suddenly saw another face in his memory. The face of Lyanna Stark. The resemblance struck him like a hammer. Robert quickly looked away. "Where is your father?" he asked. Robb answered. "Eddard Stark is still in the south, Your Grace." Robert frowned slightly. "Still in King's Landing?" "Yes." Robert nodded slowly. That man never liked leaving the capital once duty called him. But Robert's mind was not focused on Ned. It was focused on the boy standing only a few steps away. Pullip forced a smile. "Well then," he said loudly, "since Lord Stark is not here, I suppose his sons must host the king." Robb smiled proudly. "It would be our honor." Inside the great hall, the feast began quickly. Wine and food filled the long tables as soldiers and guards relaxed after the long journey. But Robert barely ate. His eyes kept returning to Jon again and again. Jon noticed it too. At first he thought the king was simply curious, but the way Robert watched him felt different, almost like he was studying him. Finally, Robert raised his cup. "Come here, boy." Jon stood and walked toward the king's table. Robert looked at him carefully. "Tell me, Jon Snow," Robert said, "do you enjoy fighting?" Jon nodded. "Yes, Your Grace." Robert grinned slightly. "Good. The North needs strong warriors." He leaned forward slightly. "And your father taught you well?" Jon hesitated for a moment. Then he answered, "Yes." Robert's eyes narrowed just a little. "Your father," he repeated slowly. Jon noticed the strange tone, but before he could say anything else, another voice spoke from the hall entrance. "Your Grace." Everyone turned. A rider had just entered the hall, still covered in snow. The man carried a sealed message. "For the king," the rider said. Robert took the letter and broke the seal. As he read the message, his expression slowly changed. The smile disappeared. His face grew serious, then angry. Robb spoke carefully. "Bad news, Your Grace." Robert folded the letter slowly. His eyes moved across the hall until they stopped on Jon again. "Yes," Robert said quietly. "Very bad news." Jon felt a chill run through him, because the way the king looked at him now was completely different. Not curious, not friendly, but something darker. Suspicion. And far away in the south, the whispers started by Petyr Baelish were beginning to spread across the realm. Secrets rarely stay buried. And the truth about Jon Snow was now dangerously close to being revealed. The dragon hidden among wolves could not stay hidden forever.